For more on this story, we're now joined by Happy Kambule from the environmental group Greenpeace. Happy, a very good evening to you. Thank you so much for joining us. Welcome to the Globe.
Good evening and thank you for having me.
First of all, Happy, take us through some of your worries about South Africa's challenges about meeting the UN climate goals.
Yeah, I think one of the biggest pieces of what makes up South Africa's contribution for climate change is that for anything in itself, we still heavily depend on hope. And the primary reason why we have something called climate change is because of things that we tend to do as humans in order to either keep alive or to have energy as well as to grow our food. But the biggest thing that's causing greenhouse gases is essentially our energy mix, primarily the use of fossil fuels. Now, in South Africa's context, that is all makes up a large proportion, about 95%, 91%, numbers you're quoting of our electricity and for energy mix.
So are you currently engaging the government about some of your concerns?
Yes, of course we are. In fact, we also sit in the Presidential Commission on Climate Change, and we're also having sort of bilateral with different partners that don't not only look at energy, but also look at the sustainability of South Africa's economy, but actually society. And also at local government to engage at a much broader scale, looks at the delivered aspects of our climate contribution.
And what are some of the key priorities do you think the government should focus on in order to meet its target?
Well, one of the key ones, as I kind of alluded to, is addressing the electricity mix. But then the secondary correlating priority would be to define what is called a just transition. Just transition basically looks at what you are moving from, so an economy that's heavily dependent on fossil fuels towards a new economy which has less dependence, or if not dependent in some cases, like in the talk that we have, away from fossil fuels. So first one is fix the mix. The second one is to develop a just transition. But we cannot run away from the fact that we also need to look at our liquid, which is primarily transport, as well as our agriculture, because agriculture and our land in general generates quite a lot of, generates a lot of.
Yeah, we'd lose you there for a second, Happy. But one of the major challenges for South Africa is the use of coal for power generation. Now that we are moving towards greener energy, are you at all optimistic?
Yeah, I mean, by addressing just the problem of climate change, there are a lot more opportunities. And in fact, there's a lot more threats from different institutions have been able to quote, as well as a lot of literature that points to the fact that if you do not address climate change, you're going to be seeing a lot more threats, and you're going to be stuck in a situation where you are unable to address what is currently happening with social, political, as well as economic. So in addressing climate change, there is an opportunity. But we are obviously a lot more conscious and a lot more encouraged what people are doing outside of government, as well as what people are also starting to what are able to do, but they're trying to also develop in terms of their own approach. But as government is doing, still a little bit lackluster, but there are signs, there are signals from the meeting that happened Friday, the Presidential Commission, as well as different signals that are sent back and forth.
So what can South Africa then do to strike a balance between powering the country's industry that are major polluters and achieving greener environment?
Yeah, I mean, that will take quite a big shift in the mentality of policymakers, because this is really a policy question. Largely what we will need is that we will need to look away from a supply side of addressing climate change and looking at the demand side. What we need to be looking at is essentially where are the biggest opportunities as well as potential to address the rising emissions of greenhouse gases, as well as increasing our adaptive capability. That sits in the city level. And then secondly, what is a key step that needs to be done in order to balance what that is there is that we need to start creating the jobs, and we need to start seeing the opportunities that are coming out of the renewable sector as well as the transition sector away from fossil fuels. And lastly is that we need to focus on where people live. South Africa has been heavily focused on big power stations, has been focused on big infrastructure, but not looking at solidifying as well as reaping the benefits that can be given when you focus on the residential sector as well as the commercial sector in order to achieve the transition, but also to bring in new economic activity that can also bolster our own economic drive.
Now, tourism may be impacted by climate change due to the loss of habitat and biodiversity and due to changes in temperature, as it were, the humidity and malaria risk. South Africa, as we know, relies heavily on its natural resource base to attract tourism, isn't it? And wildlife is the primary reason for visiting the country for some 36% of the international tourists. So do you think there is enough awareness to conscientize people about the potential dangers of compromising the tourism sector if you don't take care of the environment?
Yeah, that's a really good question, because the problem we're sitting in, or rather the situation we're in, not necessarily the problem, is that the information that concerns our lived environment as well as the conditions that our environment is in and the likely trends that are affected by or on the lived environment by climate change as well as our ability to adapt is not there, right? So, for example, we aren't necessarily quite clear as to what's going to happen to the fauna and flora when the climate increases even further. What we do know is that we've got projections up to 2100 as to what the impact will be on agricultural produce and the likely lived of animals, the much larger ones, but not necessarily sure as how much the likelihood of increasing temperatures is going to affect our, for example, our national flower, which is the protea. And what doesn't become clear in terms of tourism is that also with the patterns as well as the season and precipitation, the infrastructure that facilitates tourism is at risk. So it will be even worse for people to come to South Africa. It will be even harder for people to move around South Africa if the infrastructure is not taken care of. So more increases of temperature, more increases in precipitation destroys the infrastructure, but also the biodiversity in the area. It will start to adapt and changes the nature of tourism.
All right, Happy Kambule, great chatting to you. Thank you so much for joining us this evening.
Thank you for having me.
That was Happy Kambule of environmental organization Greenpeace, and we'd like to apologize profusely for the quality of that line. This is The Globe on SABC News. Let's take a quick break. We'll be back in a moment.